And welcome everyone. So in this video we will have a look at Web XML. So in Web XML, which is under deployed resources, web app, web INF, in that folder right away, Web XML. And we see that there is a servlet configured as a dispatcher servlet, and this dispatcher servlet class is for Spring dispatcher servlet. And the servlet mapping for this dispatcher servlet is set to star.html, so it's going to respond to URL patterns that are ending with HTML. We also see a context loader listener from Spring attached over here, and a context param for the profiles as a dev profile right now, and we'll have a look at this one later on. But number one point is dispatcher servlet. So for us to look at dispatcher servlet, the best way to do it is to just go to Spring MVC documentation and click on it, and we can see this very useful diagram. So what dispatcher servlet does for us is it acts as a front controller. So all the incoming requests come to dispatcher servlet, and then dispatcher servlet actually routes it to various controllers in the project, and it handles the requests, it creates the model, and then it interacts with the service layer. The controller then interacts with the service layer and manipulates the model in whatever way possible, and then sends the model back to the front controller, which are dispatcher servlet, and then front controller sends it back to the view template. So this is what our dispatcher servlet is in our case. So now let's have a look at where dispatcher servlet is defined. So by default, since the name is dispatcher, we are going to have dispatcher-servlet.xml file where it's going to refer. And in dispatcher servlet, we have two main annotations. One is MVC annotation driven. Two main tags that we're going to look at: MVC annotation driven, and then context : component scan. So annotation driven gives this Spring dispatcher servlet an idea that, hey, we are going to be using annotations in this project. And then component scan will let us know the base package where it is going to scan all the classes for the controller or any kind of annotation for that. So in our case, we have a com.mtcl OC controller. So if we come over the controller package, we can see there are 4 classes over here. In the first class, if we open, we see @controller annotation. So this is what will get registered as a controller bean inside the Spring dispatcher servlet. Now we see that there are 2 more beans defined. 2 beans defined over here. First bean is a tiles configurer. We are going to use this for our tiles layout. And then there is a view resolver, which is URL based view resolver, and the property view class is set as tiles view. So we are going to be using tiles in this project, and we will talk about tiles in the next video. So going back to Web XML, the second thing configured over here apart from a servlet is a listener. So this listener is a context loader listener. Context loader listener is provides us a way to get a handle of another application context XML to be initialized at the time when the dispatcher servlet is being initialized. So dispatcher servlet will create its own set of beans that are configured over here, and then context loader listener will cause application context to be initialized in its own set of beans over here. So we see that there is again context component scan, and we are gonna scan the whole MTCL OC. So everything inside this base sub package we're gonna scan except for the controllers, because controllers are going to be scanned in the dispatcher servlet. So we are gonna exclude the controllers over here. For any kind of transaction management, we'll be using this annotation driven transaction manager as transaction manager, and our transaction manager, which is being referenced over here, is Spring's transaction manager. And then our repositories are over here. So if we open one of these, we will see that they are extending JPA repositories. So our repositories are defined over here, and the JPA repositories are defined over there, and we have task annotation defined. We'll keep it aside, we'll talk about this at a later point of time. And then beans profile dev, this is the thing that we're talking about in web XML, how we have configured as a dev profile for Spring Beans. I can go back over here to show you. So here it is. In web XML we have configured the dev profile. So what that does is that it lets us choose a particular resource based on the configuration. So if we have several beans, for example, there was a dev bean, and then there was a let's say prod particular profile, and some other XML file for prod, then we could have specified two profiles, and we could switch this at the time of specifying it in web XML. So in that case, we do not need to change the code but inside the database XML files, but we can just provide different XML files and switch between the profiles. So that's a more elegant way of doing it. So let me revert these changes. Okay, so some other XML files that we have, let's have a look at them. So we also have a database dev.xml that is configured in application context that we saw. So database dev.xml, if we open this, this defines our data source, which is MySql data source, and you can see that I have an unencrypted password. There are other ways to put the password, and especially moving the data source out into the application container, itself, into the server. So there are other ways of doing this, but for the simplicity I have kept directly the data source bean right here, and defined the whole set of properties inside here. And then we are going to use local container entity manager factory bean from Spring Framework for JPA, and we are defining it as EMF as its ID. Packages to scan is the com mtcl oc entity, and these are the entities that we have seen in the previous video as well. And we are having some other properties defined. So number one, there is JPA properties, which is saying that show SQL is true, and what that means is that when our application is running, you will be seeing that in the logs you will see all the SQL being spit out right there. So if there is a select, delete, or any kind of SQL statement or HQL statement that Hibernate is running in the background, SQL statement that Hibernate is running in the background, it will spit out and will show in the console window. HBM2DLL auto is set to validate. What that means is that the database that we have set up, this particular database, when Hibernate connects to it, do not create table structure based on this particular schema, on the entity schema. Just validate that the entity schema is consistent with the database. Do not create it. You can Google more options on this and find out that there is a create, validate, a few other options that help us in connecting the JPA with the database. And then the persistence provider that we have is Hibernate persistent provider, and this shows that we are going to use Hibernate as our ORM implementation for JPA. So at a very high level, we had a look at Web XML, which is the deployment descriptor. It is the entry point of the application and tells us that we are going to use Dispatcher Servlet as the front controller. And we also saw that there is a listener configured over here for Spring Framework's context loader listener that in turn initializes application context.xml. And in application context, we are scanning all the beans, all the packages except for the controller packages, except for the controller annotation in all the packages. We're going to use transaction manager as Spring's JPA transaction manager. And the data source we are going to use that is defined in the database dev XML. So we are going to use whatever profile that we have based on web XML, and then this XML bean would be initialized, whatever is configured. In our case it is dev, so this database dev is initialized, and it picks up the reference data source from there. So if we open this, the reference data source for us is this data source. It picks up the reference data source from here, which is MySql data source, and then it also specifies our EMF, the entity manager factory bean, and the properties for our JPA in here that we want to show the SQL and we want to only validate. So thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, as usual, please leave down in the comments. I'll try my best to answer them, and I will see you into the next video. Thanks for watching.